In Georgia, 3 men accused of raping and shooting a woman before setting her on fire have been arrested, and one is expected to appear in court today. The incident happened in Columbus, Georgia. Robert Carl Johnson, Joey Garan, and Katori Glover are accused of forcing a woman they met at a party into her car at gunpoint and raping her. Then she was shot before she and her car were set on fire and abandoned. The woman was hospitalized and underwent extensive treatment. The 3 men are charged with rape, kidnapping, and arson.
What you're about to watch is a true story, an event that really happened to real people. This true crime account may be disturbing to both viewers and listeners. Thus, discretion is strongly advised.
What makes someone cross the line into unimaginable cruelty? Is it a sudden burst of rage, a twisted sense of power, or something far darker that lurks beneath the surface, waiting to emerge? These questions have haunted humanity for centuries. We hear about people who commit unspeakable acts, and we try to wrap our minds around it. We ask ourselves, how could someone do this? Were there signs? Could it have been stopped? But what happens when that darkness isn't just a fleeting moment? What if it's a choice, a deliberate, calculated decision to inflict pain and terror on another human being? What happens when the people responsible don't just cross a line, but obliterate it, leaving behind nothing but devastation? Tonight, we will look into a story that challenges the limits of our understanding of human evil. It's not a story for the faint of heart. It's about a brutal crime that unfolded in Columbus, Georgia, on New Year's Day in 2014, a day that should have symbolized fresh starts and new beginnings. But for one woman, it became a day of sheer terror, pain, and survival against all odds. Let me paint the scene for you quickly. Imagine it's New Year's Eve, a night of celebration and hope. Across the country, people are counting down the hours, toasting with friends, and setting resolutions for the year ahead. That was the atmosphere in Columbus, Georgia, a city buzzing with festive energy. At a modest house on Garden Drive, people gathered for a party. The air was alive with laughter, music, and the sound of clinking glasses. It was the kind of place where strangers became friends, and where the problems of yesterday were temporarily drowned out by the promise of tomorrow. Our story begins here, at this house, where the victim, a 36-year-old woman, found herself parked outside, enjoying the music from her car. She wasn't part of the rowdy crowd inside, but she was close enough to feel the energy of the night. The thumping bass, the muffled cheers. It was all a comforting backdrop as she sat in her 2007 Volkswagen Passat, sipping her drink and listening to the radio. At first glance, she could have been any one of us, couldn't she? A person seeking a moment of peace, a break from the noise and chaos. But her solitude would soon be shattered by the arrival of 3 men who had other intentions. Intentions that would turn a night of celebration into a living nightmare. The men, Joey Garan, Robert Johnson, and Katori Glover, were also at the party that night. On the surface, they blended in with the crowd, laughing and mingling like everyone else. But as the hours wore on, they stepped outside, their attention drawn to the lone woman in her car. What followed next was nothing short of a shock. It started innocently enough. One of them, Glover, approached this woman with a smile and an offer to buy her a drink. It was the kind of interaction that happens every day. A casual gesture, a fleeting exchange. He returned moments later with a gin and juice, sliding into the passenger seat of this woman's car. She could have had no way of knowing that this was the beginning of a terrible plan already made by these 3 strange men. Soon after, Johnson joined them, climbing into the back seat. Then Garan followed, filling the last available space. The small car became a cocoon of false camaraderie as they suggested having a freestyle rap battle. A harmless game, or so it seemed. She played along, throwing out lines and laughing as the men did the same. For a moment, it felt like nothing more than a group of people enjoying the night. But not too long, something shifted. The atmosphere grew heavy, the laughter fading into something colder. Maybe something in her words, something we may never fully understand, triggered a switch in these men. Or perhaps nothing triggered them at all. Perhaps they had planned this all along, waiting for the right moment, the right victim, the right circumstances. What we do know is that in an instant, The playful atmosphere evaporated. Glover and Johnson pulled out handguns, pressing them against her head. A simple word shattered any illusion of safety. Drive, now. This was no longer a casual encounter. This was an abduction. Drive, they barked, their voices sharp and commanding. Gripped with fear, she obeyed, holding tightly the wheel as they ordered her to leave the party behind. The once lively garden drive disappeared into the rearview mirror, replaced by the dark, empty streets of Columbus. She was no longer in control, not of the car, not of her fate. Her mind raced as she tried to process what was happening. Were they robbing her? Would they let her go? The answers, as she would soon learn, were far worse than she could have imagined. They didn't take her far, just to an abandoned trailer park off Far Road. A place with no light, no sign of people passing. The silence there was deafening, broken only by the crunch of gravel under the tires as they came to a stop. The men forced her out of the car into the cold night air, their guns still trained on her. She shivered, not just from the chill but from the terror coursing through her veins. The next few hours would be a descent into unimaginable horror, acts so brutal, so inhuman, that even the lead investigator on the case would later call it one of the worst crimes he had ever encountered. But even in the face of this nightmare, the victim's will to live burned brighter than the darkness surrounding her. But before we go deeper into the horrors that happened that night, it's important to understand who these men were. These weren't impulsive teenagers or drug-addled strangers. These were calculated predators with histories that hinted at the darkness to come. Johnson, at just 13 years old, had been convicted in juvenile court for forcing an 8-year-old girl to perform oral sex. Glover had a record of domestic violence, having been convicted of battery for attacking his wife. Guerin was already out on bond for drug distribution charges. As the clock struck midnight and fireworks lit up the Columbus sky, celebrating the dawn of 2014, these three men were about to commit acts so heinous that they would shock a community, test the limits of human survival, and force us all to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of evil itself. What happens next is a testament to human resilience, the unbreakable spirit of survival, and the pursuit of justice against those who commit the most heinous of crimes. Stay with me as we unravel the rest of this harrowing tale, a story that will stay with you long after you've heard it. You're watching True Crime Stories 24/7. Thanks for joining. Please do well to subscribe and like this video to support us. This woman had no idea that her night of terror was only beginning. Under the cold, uncaring darkness of the abandoned lot on Far Road, she was forced to confront a level of cruelty that defied comprehension. The men ordered her to strip. At gunpoint, she removed her clothing piece by piece until she stood naked, shivering in the frigid air. Vulnerable and exposed, she desperately tried to cling to some shred of hope, some faint belief that this nightmare would end. But the reality was far worse than she could have anticipated. The three men seemed to revel in her humiliation. They treated her not as a human being, but as an object, a vessel for their twisted desires. Glover, Guerin, and Johnson began their sickening assault, subjecting her to unspeakable acts of violence. They forced her to perform sexual acts while taunting her, laughing as if her pain was some form of entertainment. They used their guns, sodomizing her with the cold, unyielding metal, compounding her agony. Each man took turns, passing her around as though she were a toy, a disposable thing with no value. In the victim's later testimony, she described it in chillingly simple terms. They were passing me around like a piece of cake. It was a phrase that would haunt the courtroom, a stark reminder of the casual cruelty with which they inflicted their horrors. But the violence wasn't enough for them. The men seemed to feed off her suffering, growing more emboldened with every moment. They weren't just assaulting her, they were torturing her, taking pleasure in her pain. The victim later recalled how they appeared to enjoy themselves as if her torment was a game they couldn't get enough of. This wasn't a crime of passion or desperation. It was calculated, deliberate, and purely evil. Glover and Johnson, still brandishing their handguns, found new ways to inflict pain and humiliation. They used their weapons not just as tools of intimidation, but as instruments of torture, simultaneously assaulting her both vaginally and anally. The victim would later testify that they were really getting off on her pain and terror. This wasn't just violence, it was a celebration of cruelty. When they finally stopped the sexual assault, it wasn't out of mercy. They decided to escalate things further. The men forced her into the trunk of her own car, a cramped, suffocating space where the darkness was absolute. As they slammed the trunk shut, she felt the cold steel of her confinement pressing in around her. But even in that moment of despair, she found a glimmer of determination. She refused to stay there, to let them have complete control. Summoning every ounce of strength she had, she managed to push the trunk open and escape. For a brief, fleeting moment, she thought she might have a chance. She stumbled out into the open, her body battered and her mind racing with survival instincts. But the men were faster. They saw her attempt to flee and acted swiftly to crush her hope. Johnson and Glover opened fire. The sharp crack of gunshots shattered the stillness of the night as bullets tore through the air. One struck her in the chest, collapsing her lungs and leaving her gasping for breath. Another hit her in the abdomen, causing internal injuries that would require part of her lower intestine to be removed. More bullets struck her knee and hand, breaking bones and leaving her unable to run. She fell to the ground, her body racked with pain, but she wasn't dead. Not yet. The men approached her again, dragging her back to the car. It was then that they committed the final, horrifying act of the night. They retrieved a gas can from her trunk and doused her with gasoline. The acrid smell burned her nostrils as she lay there, helpless. The men lit a match and set her on fire. Flames engulfed her body, searing her skin and causing unimaginable agony. But even as the fire consumed her, she refused to give up. She rolled on the ground, desperate to extinguish the flames, her survival instincts kicking in once more. The men, perhaps thinking they had finished the job, began to retreat. Like gunslingers in a Wild West standoff, they lined up and fired more shots at her as they backed away. But somehow, miraculously, she survived. She clung to life, her body broken and burned, as she lay naked and bleeding in the dirt. The night was eerily silent now, the chaos giving way to an oppressive stillness. She cried out for help, her voice hoarse and strained, carrying into the void. For what must have felt like an eternity, there was no response. But then, from the nearby trailer park, someone heard her cries. A neighbor, awakened by the sound, called the police. When the paramedics arrived, they found her on the brink of death. Her injuries were extensive: first and second-degree burns, multiple gunshot wounds, fractures, and devastating internal damage. A bullet lodged in her chest had collapsed a lung, making it nearly impossible for her to breathe. She was clinging to life by the thinnest of threads, but she was alive. The paramedics worked quickly, stabilizing her as best they could before rushing her to the hospital. Their swift action saved her life, but her journey was far from over. The physical scars would be lasting, and the emotional wounds even deeper. Yet, even in the face of such overwhelming trauma, she held on. Her strength, her sheer will to survive, would later be described by the judge as nothing short of extraordinary. As the sun rose over Columbus, the nightmare of the previous night began to come to light. The police launched an investigation that would reveal the full extent of the horror inflicted upon the victim. And as the community learned of the crime, a collective sense of outrage and disbelief took hold. How could this happen? How could anyone survive such an ordeal? But the victim did survive. Her survival would become a rallying cry for justice, a determination to ensure that the men responsible for this atrocity would be held accountable for their actions. Her story wasn't over. It was just beginning. The woman's remarkable will to live was not only a miracle but also the catalyst that led to justice. In the aftermath of her horrific ordeal, the Columbus Police Department launched an investigation that would come to define the careers of the officers involved. Lead investigator Lieutenant Lance Deaton, a veteran of 16 years in law enforcement and 10 years specializing in violent crimes, described the case as one of the most brutal he had ever encountered. But the road to justice was not straightforward. The men who had inflicted this unimaginable cruelty, Joey Guerin, Robert Johnson, and Katori Glover, were confident that they had left no loose ends. They thought their victim's silence was ensured, her body destroyed. What they didn't anticipate was her resilience, her unyielding determination to expose them, and the strength of a community that rallied behind her. As the victim recovered in the hospital, police began piecing together the events of that fateful night. Evidence at the scene painted a chilling picture. Her car, reduced to a burned-out shell, the bullet casings scattered across the lot, and traces of gasoline on the ground. The physical evidence spoke volumes, but it was the victim's testimony that would prove to be the most damning. Despite the excruciating pain she was in, she provided detectives with every detail she could recall about her attackers. Her descriptions of the three men were precise and unflinching. She recounted how Glover had initially approached her with a drink, how Johnson had joined shortly after, and how Guerin had been the last to climb into her car. She described the guns they used, the insults they hurled, and the way they seemed to take pleasure in her suffering. Her words painted a vivid and horrifying picture of the events, leaving no doubt about the identities of her attackers. With this information, Lieutenant Deaton and his team began tracking down the suspects. All three men had been at the party on Garden Drive, and it didn't take long for witnesses to confirm their presence. Surveillance footage from nearby cameras captured their movements that night, providing additional evidence to corroborate the victim's account. Within days, Guerin, Johnson, and Glover were taken into custody. The arresting officers described the men as calm and unremorseful, their expressions betraying no hint of guilt or fear. In their initial interrogations, they denied everything. But as the evidence mounted, their stories began to unravel. In a chilling attempt to escape accountability, all three men claimed that the victim had consented to everything that happened. They told investigators that the sexual acts were part of a consensual encounter and that she had willingly participated. It was a grotesque lie, one that would later be dissected and dismantled in court. The victim's physical injuries alone told a story of brutality and violence that no amount of false testimony could erase. As the case moved to trial, the community of Columbus braced itself for what would become one of the most harrowing courtroom dramas in recent memory. The trial was not just about seeking justice for the victim. It was about confronting the darkest aspects of human behavior and ensuring that such acts would never be tolerated. When the trial began, the courtroom was packed. Reporters, advocates, and members of the public gathered to witness the proceedings, their collective gaze fixed on the three men who sat at the defendant's table. Each man was represented by a defense attorney who, despite the overwhelming evidence, worked tirelessly to reduce their clients' sentences. The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Sadana Daly, presented a case that left no room for doubt. Daly's opening statement was as powerful as it was direct. These men are predators. They took pleasure in torturing their victim, and they thought they could escape justice. But today, the truth will prevail. Over the course of the trial, the prosecution laid out the evidence with meticulous precision. Forensic experts testified about the victim's injuries, describing the burns, gunshot wounds, and internal damage in heartbreaking detail. Crime scene analysts walked the jury through the evidence collected from the abandoned lot, including the bullet casings and the burned remnants of the victim's car. But it was the victim's testimony that delivered the most profound impact. When she took the stand, the courtroom fell silent. Her voice, though steady, carried the weight of her trauma as she recounted the events of that night. She described the fear, the pain, and the moments when she thought she wouldn't survive. She also described the determination that kept her going, the refusal to let her attackers win. As she faced her attackers in court, she spoke directly to them. "You thought you had broken me," she said, "but I'm still here. I survived, and I will make sure you never hurt anyone else again." The defense tried to cast doubt on her testimony, suggesting inconsistencies and pointing to the defendant's claims of consent. But the prosecution swiftly dismantled these arguments, presenting the overwhelming evidence of violence and coercion. Daly's closing argument was a scathing indictment of the defendant's actions. These men treated their victim as though she were disposable, as though her life had no value. They showed no remorse, no humanity, and now they must face the consequences of their actions. The jury deliberated for only 2.5 hours before delivering their verdict, guilty on nearly every count. The room erupted in a mixture of relief and emotion as the judge prepared to deliver the sentences. Judge Arthur Smith did not mince words as he addressed the defendants. The testimony in this case was some of the most brutal I have heard in my tenure as a superior court judge, he said. Your actions were heinous, cruel, and completely devoid of humanity. But for the victim's extraordinary will to live, this would have been a murder case. Glover and Johnson were each sentenced to life without parole, plus 5 consecutive life sentences and additional years for their crimes. Guerin received life without parole, plus 4 consecutive life sentences. The sentences ensured that none of them would ever walk free again. The victim, though scarred by her ordeal, found solace in the verdict. Justice was served, she said. They can never do this to anyone else. They'll never hurt another woman. As the courtroom emptied and the case was closed, the story remained a sobering reminder of the resilience of the human spirit and the importance of standing against evil. The victim's courage, the investigator's diligence, and the prosecution's unyielding pursuit of justice ensured that the darkness of that New Year's night would not have the final word. The case of the Columbus attack stands as one of the darkest examples of human cruelty, but also one of the brightest testaments to resilience and justice. The victim endured unimaginable suffering at the hands of her attackers, yet she emerged as a beacon of courage and strength. Her survival against all odds wasn't just a victory for her, it was a victory for every survivor who has ever been silenced, doubted, or overlooked. In the years since the crime, her story has resonated far beyond the courtroom in Columbus, Georgia. It's a reminder that evil exists, but so does the power of the human spirit. It's a story that challenges us to confront the harsh realities of our world while inspiring us to fight for justice and humanity. For the 3 men, Joey Guerin, Robert Johnson, and Katori Glover, their sentences ensured that they would never harm anyone again. They were stripped of their freedom and condemned to spend the rest of their lives in the confines of prison walls. And for the victim, though her wounds, both physical and emotional, may never fully heal, she has the peace of knowing that her strength ensured justice was served. As we close this chapter, we're left with more than just the details of a brutal crime. We're left with questions that echo through society. How can we prevent such tragedies? How can we better protect the vulnerable? And how can we support survivors who, like this woman, rise from the ashes of their pain to become symbols of hope? True crime stories like this one aren't just about recounting what happened. They're about learning, reflecting, and growing as a society. They're about honoring the victims, holding the guilty accountable, and ensuring that the world knows their names, not as faceless perpetrators, but as individuals who overcame the unimaginable. If you found this story compelling, if it moved you, enraged you, or left you with a deeper understanding of the complexities of justice, then make sure to subscribe to True Crime Stories 24/7. We bring you real stories of crime and survival from across the world. Stories that matter, stories that demand to be told. By subscribing to this channel, you join a community that seeks to honor victims, question the status quo, and shed light on the darker corners of our world. Together, we can keep these conversations alive, ensure justice continues to prevail, and stand with survivors like the woman in this story. So hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and stay with us for more in-depth true crime stories, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Thank you for watching, and until next time, stay informed, stay aware, and stay safe.